Welcome to the Action Network podcast. This is the best bets episode for the 153rd Open Championship, teeing off this week at Royal Portrush on the windy shores of the North Atlantic in Northern Ireland. This is just the third time that the Open has been played outside of Great Britain, and as our guest today will explain, it is a unique links course that will chew up and spit out the field this week. I'm your host, Mike Calabrese, and today, as I mentioned, I am joined by two brilliant minds in the golf betting space. First up, returning to the show, our golf betting expert, two-time Fantasy Sports Writer Association Golf Writer of the Year, and senior PGA analyst at Rotoballer. Follow him over at Tee Off Sports. Welcome back to the show, Spencer Aguiar.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate you having me on today. I always enjoy doing this with Kyle. I feel like we've had a lot of great episodes. We've been in lockstep. We've talked about it. I'm not going to make any promises. I don't know where Kyle's at with his card so far this week, but I feel like I've gone a little bit of rogue with what a lot of people have done. So we might have some unique takes here.
Today we'll be consulting Spencer's model, hoping to deliver the best edges that he's seeing this week at Royal Portrush. We're also joined by my Roto Grinders colleague. He's one of the foremost data modelers and really in the entire world of golf. So when it comes to crunching down on the numbers and taking out some of those gut feelings and just going by what the stats are saying, Kyle Murray is the man to do it. You can follow him over at KMurDFS over on X. Kyle, how you doing, brother?
Yeah, I'm doing good. It's been a great past 3-4 weeks of outright betting. So hopefully we can keep that going with this final major of the year. It's always a fun time to get on here and talk about the upcoming major with you guys. So I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, hopefully we can find another winner this week.
But before we dive into who will hoist the claret jug at the end of the week, could you two set the stage for our audience, maybe some people who aren't regularly betting on golf or aren't tuned in to every single tournament leading up to the majors? What specifically makes the Open Championship a difficult event to handicap or to model? I'll start with you first, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if anyone's been tuning in to the major championship episodes over the course this year outside of the Augusta one, the new course is always a fun little way to add a wrinkle into these sorts of events. Obviously, we saw this course last in 2019, but in terms of adding that wrinkle into modeling, I think that will also bring in a new fun layer. But I think the biggest thing for especially the Open Championship, obviously, being a coastal environment, a links sort of course set up here, I think it's going to come down to weather a ton. And to be transparent, that's usually a spot where my model has a little bit more difficulty in terms of predicting the event, and therefore I need to use some outlying stats of guys, how they perform in these weather conditions. And obviously, especially in an environment like this where the winds can change so quickly and frequently, it's going to bring a whole new wrinkle into being able to predict who can play well and who is expected to have a strong baseline here. So I think that's probably the biggest wrinkle and the biggest predictor within this sort of championship event. I think obviously doing this fairly early on Tuesday, there's a fairly good chance we're going to see some weather forecasts change leading up to the time these guys are actually teeing off. So keep that in mind as well. I would probably stay up to date on Twitter or whatnot with maybe some of our plays and some of our picks. But I think that's probably the biggest wrinkle for me and my model coming into this week, and just kind of figuring out first what the weather is going to look like, if it's going to be an impact, if there's going to be a wave advantage. Obviously, that could also be thrown out the window if there's any sort of rain delay. But first of all, that's kind of the first step in terms of finding out where that weather is going to be, and then next finding out guys who might have an advantage in whatever kind of weather conditions we're expecting to look at.
Philosophically, Spencer, how do you respond to an event that potentially the weather could be different when you're teeing off in the morning to just 90 minutes later? Does that make you change how you attack an event like this, perhaps taking some money out of the pre-tournament basket and putting into that live betting strategy?
I think Kyle kind of hit it on the head. I mean, any time that you get one of these European link style courses, the volatile weather is always going to be what makes it most difficult. The other thing I do want to add to that I found, or I always find problems within these major championships, we've talked about it on the first three shows. It's going to be no different here. There are sites out there that have information for the live golfers, but you get these really small pockets of data. A lot of it is going to make this building process more difficult. So I think when you have the weather and then just these live golfers that get thrown into the mix, to me, that is the most difficult part of the handicapping process. As far as the weather is concerned, It's a difficult one, like Kyle talked about. The biggest concern with it is we could look at the weather report and for DFS contests and things of that nature, I would wait as long as you could to actually work in a player pool and figure out where you want to land. But the weather changes so quickly on coastal courses that at any given time you might think you have a weather edge. All of a sudden, Kyle talked about it. Rain comes into play. There's a delay that happens. We've seen that happen numerous times. So it did change the outlook of how I built my card this week. And when we talk about outrights, we'll get into the path that I decided to go with it. And maybe to me, that's where I went a little bit different than what a lot of people may be talking about. Like I said, I'm curious to hear what Kyle has to say. I know he's been on a roll right now. So if any of his luck can rub off on me, I would be very glad to have that. But, it's a challenging course that's a modernized link style venue, and it is going to eat people up, as you guys have said. You have internal out of bounds, you have gorse grass, you have bunkers that come into play. There are undulated greens and a very slow fescue surface where you have to be a good approach putter. You have to have an all-around game. It really tests every single club in your bag.
As we've done for the other majors thus far this season, we're going to start with the high-end golfers, the top 10 in the market right now in terms of odds that you would like to, at least put a little bit of capital behind and make an investment before the tournament starts. But a quick aside, just to kind of give some perspective on the wild outcomes that this course produces. Rory McIlroy famously shot a 61 on this course at just 16 years old, only to come back on the exact same course in 2019 and shoot an 8 on number 1, later missing the cut. So it just shows you can be dominant on this course one day and then all of a sudden turn around and you have some serious issues with OB getting out of those pot bunkers, the contours of the fairway that Spencer was just referring to, the humps and hollows, the pot bunkers. They can create doubles and triples that can ruin a round and potentially ruin your entire tournament in a single hole. Even the greens are unique in that so many are surrounded by the dunes. You have blind shots. You have slopes that are unforgiving. With all that being said, let's start at the very top of the odds board. You got Scotty at 9-2, Rory at 7-1, Rahm at 12-1. Of those three, are you interested in buying any pre-tournament, Kyle, or is there someone else within the top 10 right now that you view as the best value?
Yeah, it's been tough kind of to decipher where I'm at in terms of these top 3 options. I right now no current outright bets on any of these top 3 guys, which is fairly scary for me in a major. Obviously, Jon Rahm's been the guy that I've been backing in previous majors, and he's performed well, 2 top 10 finishes in those last 2 events. And I do like him again here. But in terms of just trying to find the best value, I think I'm going to be going a little bit further down the board. The first guy that I'm looking at inside this top 10 is actually going to be Xander Schauffele. I bet him last week at around 20-1. And it's just, I think, a spot where there's just some natural value on a guy like Xander, who I think that when he is at his peak, I think he's fairly worthy of being back in this top tier with some of these guys. Obviously, I do think he would be 4th, maybe competing with Bryson in that sort of tier 1B there. But in terms of, when you look at Xander's profile, obviously coming off of the offseason injury last year, there's clearly rust, right, coming into this season. He's definitely been battling that. But like I mentioned, I backed him last week, finished T8 at the Scottish Open, but he played really well. He just couldn't really get anything going with the putter. He actually led the field in strokes gained on approach, which I think is going to be very, very important, especially for him, and seeing that sort of come into form for a guy like Xander, who has been so great with his irons over the course of the last 2-3 years. So when it comes down to it, at 25-1 here for Xander, he's just simply fallen out of this top tier. And again, if he can find that peak again of form, I do think he's worthy of being, a guy who's 12, 13, 14-1 in a major championship. Obviously, won this event last year, different course, so not necessarily comparing that, but we know that he has the ability to win a major championship, especially when he's in form. And I think what I saw last week was very positive, especially considering iron play is the one concern that I really had for him in terms of being in that top form. So to see him go out there and lead a pretty strong field in that category was extremely encouraging for me. Over the last year, he ranks 4th in strokes gained approach. He's also ranks 10th in total strokes gained, tee to green. So, and then when you look at some of the course success that he's had on coastal and links courses, I'm taking a little bit of more looks at coastal courses as well for this event. Obviously, with it being up at the the coastal part of Northern Ireland, I think that's actually going to be a spot to maybe just enhance your sample a little bit. But when you look at those 2 course environments, over the last couple of years, Xander ranks 2nd just behind Scotty in total strokes gained. So I think it's a great fit for Xander. And I do think that it's a spot where there's some natural value just because of obviously the market being so heavy on these top three guys, and rightfully so, no doubt about that. But also the fact that Xander has just had a little bit of rust on him. But I do want to be early on Xander because I do see him rounding into form, especially with that strong week that he had last week.
Before we get into the elite golfers that you're backing here, Spencer, let's talk about the favorite in this tournament, Scottie Scheffler. Just 2 months ago, he was getting priced in the neighborhood of the elite Tiger Woods prime era, where he was going off at minus 200s, minus 300s, or excuse me, at plus 300s. What's interesting is he's come back down to earth a little bit, but he's still obviously the prohibitive favorite here. Do you see any value now that it's creeping closer to 5-1, or is he still a golfer where, with the sample size and what you potentially could get in a live betting opportunity, if he gets off to a slow start, that's preferable as opposed to tying up your money for 72 holes at such a short number?
I'm going to give a wild answer that I normally don't come on shows and say. If you look at Scottie Scheffler's price, and the problem is, I understand you're tying up money pre-tournament if you bet him, but the problem is even if he starts slowly, books, whether it's him or Rory, we even saw it with Rory entering Sunday at the Genesis Scottish Open. Rory was the favorite to win it entering that final day. But when you look at the actual pricing, my model had him at about 36% to win. If you look at what the pricing was, he was about 45 to 47% at most places. So you're never going to get what is a fair value or what should be deemed to be a fair value on those guys. So for me with Scottie, it's one of those spots, and I've seen it drift even closer to 6 at some spots out there to 1 on Scottie. I do think that you can consider that. Like, there were 3 routes that I considered here. Kyle talked about the first one with Jon Rahm, 12-1. I think that's something that you can consider. Scottie Scheffler is that 5.5, 6-1 range, a little bit more tangible to enter this week. And then the third route for me is, did I want to do, and which is what I ended up doing, did I want to stack what ended up being a 5-6 man card, try to take on the favorites this week? Just to very quickly touch on the Rahm and Scottie route with it. I bypassed the Rahm route. I just thought 12-1 was a little bit too short. I think Kyle kind of hit it on the head there, where value is value. And I'm not so sure at 12-1, whether he wins or doesn't win, that there's actually value at that number. He's likely very close to winning again. We've seen that evidence by his outperformance when you just compare him with some of the strokes gained data to live golfers over the last 2 months. He's nearly a shot better in my projection there. I just found concerns backing Rahm when he hasn't won in nearly a year. Like, this is obviously a spot where he can turn it around, but when we're looking from a value answer, if my model thinks Scottie at 5.5, 6-1 is better value than Rahm, I really don't want to tie up an entire card with Rahm being my solo choice there. I've talked about this numerous times on action shows. I don't have a ton of exposure for these tournaments in the outright market. I like to get my exposure elsewhere. I usually put in, we all do units different the way that we spread it out, but I usually have about a half unit to 0.6 of a unit that I put into an outright card a week. So, for me specifically, if I bet Jon Rahm, that's my entire week. I'm not adding anybody else. Scottie would probably be a little bit lower of a bet if I would have gone that route with it. But I decided, as I said, to go in this route where I wanted to take 2 of the names in the 30 to 40 range, 2 in the 60 to 80, and then 2 long shots. I like the Xander call that Kyle talked about. I consider that myself. One of the things that I always run is I run the baseline statistics. So it takes the actual ball striking of the tournament. It then merges in some of the baseline short game stats that you should expect for them. Xander entered Sunday at the Scottish Open as the number 1 projected scorer on the board. I think we've seen that from Xander quite a bit this year. He has not been able to put all the pieces together to actually compete on it. I did consider it, but I ended up going with Ludwig Åberg at 30-1. I'm under this belief. I've said this quite frequently. We aren't going to go forever without Åberg being a major champion winless drought of what this is. I know he's only 25, but I think the question becomes, what is the best venue for him to capture his first Grand Slam title? The natural answer, you're not going to necessarily get pushback from me of what his best course is, will be Augusta. We've seen that with back-to-back top 10 finishes there. But I thought for all the difficulty that Royal Portrush presented, it had enough birdie-making potential that a lot of the statistics inside my model outweighed some of those flaws that Åberg seems to have in navigating mistakes. My model ranked him first in this field from 200 plus yards for proximity. He was second in this field for weighted off the tee performance. And I think it might be that combination that ends up proving to be the ultimate weapon for him because of this high-end approach putting that I talked about. You're going to get a lot of putts here from 30 plus feet. So if he's one of the best approach players from the proximity numbers I'm looking for, if he's one of the best drivers and he's able to avoid some of those mistakes that we know are going to come into play because of his putting, I think this is a very desirable location for him on a number that seems to be drifting on him after, for honestly, my first two choices here, names that everybody seemed to want to back last week. Not as bullish, it doesn't feel like that the public is this go around. And with that in mind, I took Robert McIntyre at 40-1. I did not bet him last week. I know that performance was a very big disappointment for most. You finished 65th as when you're one of the biggest. I thought he was a fringe value. I don't know if it was necessarily the price I wanted it to be, but when you're one of the golfers where sharp money did hit him, like there's no doubt about that last week, and now all of a sudden nobody's on him. I don't think that this is a price that is too short like a lot of people seem to think it is. You could make that argument when it opened at that 25 to 28 to 1 mark, but I think as this continues to drift to 40 and higher, McIntyre becomes really intriguing. I talked about the stats for Oberg. McIntyre possesses a lot of the similar answers that I'm looking for there. He's also second in my model for scrambling from the rough. He's third in weighted strokes gained total when I geared it towards Portrush, seventh in overall weighted scrambling. And then the high-end marks that I didn't talk about this a lot when I was talking about my model, but and even Kyle mentioned, like there's a lot of weird stats that get put into play this week. Like it is not as conventional of a build as I normally would do. I looked at reduce hang time off the tee. I didn't want golfers that were going to get their ball caught up in the wind. I looked at expected approach play in nastier conditions. Those were a lot of the reasons why McIntyre has found success in the past. And when you look at it from a statistical perspective, it's all the same areas that are popping for him this week. So, I don't even know how aggressive you need to be in getting this in as soon as you listen to it. I think this number is going to continue drifting. And if you can tell me that this is going to get 40 plus, I think McIntyre is an interesting value there.
As we turn to the mid-tier and long shot golfers that you like to overperform this week, I'll start with you first, Kyle. In terms of the golfers that you're targeting in two main buckets, are you someone who prefers an elite scrambler like a Hideki Matsuyama or a Tommy Fleetwood, or would you rather, given the course conditions, to target someone inside the top 10 in greens and regulation like a Patrick Cantlay or a Sepp Straka?
Yeah, I feel bad because I feel like you asked this question at the U.S. Open, and I kind of just said like all around golfers are typically the guys that are going to stand out, and I do still agree with that here, but I am giving a little bit of an edge to approach players here, and that's mainly because I find that a lot of these top approach players that I'm looking at this week are also guys who just perform well in the wind, and that kind of goes hand in hand at times. It's not always a clear-cut correlation there with guys who perform well in the wind and guys who are strong on approach, but a lot of times these guys do line up. So I think that's a huge point here. And I do think that guys who are going to be able to prevent themselves from being put into bad positions based on either their experience in the wind, their ability to keep the ball low, different shape, different shots, I think will go a long way. And those typically happen to be the best ball strikers. So I am going to give a slight advantage here to some of these top end ball strikers, especially guys on approach here and the guys who are going to consistently hit greens and regulation. But I think that kind of goes back to a couple of these spots here. I know I mentioned Xander as like the top end guy for me, and maybe I mistakenly forgot to leave. Maybe I mistakenly left some guys out of those ranges there. But I also do have a bet out there on Tommy Fleetwood as well, who I do think is a guy who can definitely scramble as well as be a guy who can outperform the field on approach. So he's another top end play that I have. But in terms of some of these mid-range guys that I'm looking at, the first guy that I'm finding myself clicking on this week in the mid-range is Sepp Straka here at 50-1. He's a guy who I do think is going to be a guy who can consistently contend in major championships and eventually win one. Obviously, he's had some really strong form. He has 2 top 7 finishes over his last 4 starts. He is kind of a risk-reward type player. Like when we see him on, he's really able to contend and compete, but he also has some missed cut upside in his bag as well. When looking at some of the condition filters that I've been looking at, Again, back to that true that coastal style and links style play. He's a guy who ranks in the top 10 in total strokes gained in those conditions over the last 2 years. Another guy who also performs well in mid to extreme winds. So Sepp Straka, I do think, is more than capable of handling some conditions that might arise here. He's also very accurate ball striker as well. He ranks 6th in accuracy off the tee, and he's 5th in terms of strokes gained on approach over the last 6 months. So he kind of checks a lot of those boxes. He has shown some struggles with the short game as well, ranking outside the top 100 over the last year, but he is back inside the top 70 over the last 6 months. So we have seen some slight improvements there, but it could be a spot where he could find himself getting in some trouble if he's not hitting greens frequently. But again, I do feel confident that he's going to be able to avoid some of these big scores because he does hit lots of greens, ranks 14th over the last year in greens and regulation, 10th in bogey avoidance in this field. So he checks a lot of these boxes in terms of being a safer option, a guy who can avoid some of these big scores. So he's probably going to be a guy who finds himself contending in this event if it's one that is a nastier condition type event where the score is a little bit lower. But I'm more than happy to throw a bet out there on Sepp Straka at 50-1, kind of, and potentially, honestly, just hope for some mayhem, right? Hope for the scores to be a little lower than maybe some of the average watchers might want to see. But I do think that's a spot where a guy like Sepp Straka would flourish.
Spencer, when it comes to these mid-tier and long shot candidates, obviously you need to take a leap of faith in one way or another. And sometimes it can be, can they elevate and put it all together for 4 consecutive rounds, that consistency question, or placing aside the recency bias of maybe they're not playing their best golf in the last 2 to 3 weeks, and you just have to trust your model and where they are on a year-round basis as opposed to what they've been in, let's call it, the last 6 to 8 rounds of golf that they played. Which one is more difficult for you to get over, and who are you targeting in this range?
I think in the outright market, you always need to be shooting for upside. I feel like that's one of the biggest mistakes that ends up occurring in the space where people are a little too results oriented in a short-term perspective with it. You have to understand that when a guy has been performing well, books also are aware of that, and they are very quick to move numbers in those spots. And I think that's sometimes lost in translation as bets get made in the space. And, I run things from a very long-term perspective. I've always come on with you, Michael, and always told you, like, I'm running it from a longer-term perspective, I would say, than 99% of people in the space. And there are some downsides that come into play. It's not a perfect exact science. And, I'll always run the shorter-term data just to see where things land with it. But the way I ended up looking at this is I thought there were prices on golfers where there is a narrative built around them that either 1, they cannot win a major championship, 2, they are not a golfer that theoretically should perform well in Europe, even though the data says otherwise, or 3, they may be a golfer that just doesn't have enough major championship experience, and those numbers were a little heightened to start the week. So, I mentioned this a second ago. There are 4 additional names that I had on my card. The next option as far as the price was, and I don't think very many people are going to back him. This is one of the spots where I've kind of put my feet into the sand and it seemed to be digging in on this play here. I like Justin Thomas at 60-1. I said this last week at the Scottish Open. This narrative around him has likely been overblown of what we see in Europe. When you look at what derails him, and this is not a perfect exact science and not a perfect exact answer I'm about to give, but the 2 items that derail him most would be, 1, courses that punish wayward drives. We do know that Portrush is going to do that. So that is a negative to throw into the Thomas bucket. But the second thing when we look at the off the tee data is courses that demand what I would call complete sends off the tee, where you have to be extremely aggressive, but that challenging scoring and the thick rough or the internal out of bounds comes into play. Like, I don't think Thomas has to send driver every single time in these spots. When you look at him from a statistical perspective, yes, the driver is what gets him in problem, and he's going to be a boom or bust choice, and it's going to come down to how wide his misses end up being, and if they're very wide, that's going to be his undoing. But we have seen at locations like TPC Sawgrass in the past, he clubs down, he hits these little low stingers, he finds a fairway. Open championships are, we'll see where there's some rain in the forecast, but I still think this is going to be pretty firm on the fairways at least, where you're going to get some rollout there. So my low ball flight numbers liked him. I think he can generate a lot of rollout extra distance from that nature of it. And when we saw him play this course in 2019, like everybody wants to cherry pick all the bad that he has when he's entered over into Europe. Well, this is a course he came top 10 in when he played it. And it was a pretty challenging venue that year. I'm hoping that, maybe the opposite of what Kyle said, to where a guy like Straka, if you ramp up the conditions and you make it more difficult, a guy like Straka gets better. I'm hoping that if the reverse of this happens and this ends up becoming a little bit easier, kind of with the same thing I said with Oberg, all of a sudden a guy like Thomas can work himself up the leaderboard. These par 4 locations are extremely difficult. You're going to have to salvage scores there. Thomas is one of the best in the world at doing that. He also has a short game that is as creative as it comes. So it's going to come down to the driver, very high ceiling, very low play. Not necessarily looking for him in safety markets, but trying to shoot for a little upside there. I took Russell Henley at 80-1. That price is more in the 60s now if you shop around. I tweeted this out on my Twitter on X, I guess it is now, on Monday. But when you take expected proximity inside my model, the low ball flight that I just talked about, how closely you miss a fairway, that's where this internal out of bounds and all the gorse bushes and all the really bad stuff comes into play. So the smaller you can miss in the smaller areas that you miss, the better off you are. Take expected scrambling, approach putting. There was only one golfer in my sheet that was higher when you took all of those stats and weighed them equally together. That's Scotty Scheffler. I think that being able to get a 60-1 plus number on Henley is a little bit of this. He's a 35-plus-year-old golfer at this point of his life that has just in the mind of the public actually become this fringe top 10 player. And I honestly don't think people actually view him that way. It's very easy to call him that when he's in a weak field. When you throw him into some of these more significant contests, I feel like people are very quick to get off of him. This is an accurate golfer. This is somebody that can find fairways. This is a quality proximity player. I would argue that was probably the best value that I had on the board. And there's something to be said. He's a much better golfer in my model than this player, but like he's the overall better approach player of the shorter hitter that Brian Harmon was a couple years ago. And I see no reason why Henley couldn't get himself across the finish line this week. And then just to throw out the last two long shots that I took at 101 plus numbers, I took Andrew Novak at 250-1. That's dropped more into the 200-1 range now. That's kind of what you were talking about, Michael. We saw him bounce back a little bit last week, but this was a golfer that was red hot to start the year, and it has not been as quality of finishes up until recently. And I think he's starting to turn it around now for a quality scrambler, quality approach player here. And then last bet I'm going to give on here, I've seen this number range between as low as 80-1. It opened as high as 200-1. There are local Vegas shops that are still at 150-1. For the sake of this discussion, I'll call it 130-1. I took Maverick McNeely. This is what I was talking about when you look at a lack of major championship success only telling part of the story. Look at recent years, Wyndham Clark, JJ Spawn. Those are two names that have bucked conventional wisdom when you look at capturing a title, probably much before the public deemed them to be ready when you just look at their past results. I wrote about this in one of my articles. I think McNeely has a little bit of that Wyndham Clark within his game where he uses distance and putting as his main weapons. The approach play is going to have to be better than it is on most weeks, but even though there's nothing better than a 23rd on his resume over 11 Grand Slam events, I do think we've seen him turn a corner recently. 3 top 37 finishes in the 3 majors this year. That's going to come alongside the breakthrough victory that he had in the fall. And then we've had a few close calls from him this season, including when we were in California there for a while. And I know a lot of those tournaments are going to be more geared towards his game, but fescue greens are always bumpy greens, slow bumpy greens. POA greens are bumpy greens. I think that there's a correlation that can be made between a tournament like Pebble Beach, where he's found success, to where he's going to, that's like Americanized link style golf, in my opinion. I know he doesn't have European link style success, but I think that number should have been more like 60-1. Like, to me, that's a massive disparity when we're looking at this 100-1 plus range.
Figuratively speaking, we're running out of daylight here in today's episode. So let's play Ready Golf, speed through the rest of your card if you have any additional plays to tag on here or just philosophies that you'd like to throw out to our audience before we wrap here. Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's worth that. I think out of all the majors that we've seen over the course of the season, I do think the Open Championship is probably the one that has brought, long shots most into play. Obviously, just over the course of, when you look at data over the past 10 to 12 years of guys who have won at different majors, this is the one that has kind of brought in some of these guys into play a little bit more. So I'll throw out, 5 or 6 top 20 guys that I'll also throw some sprinkles on for long shots. I think it's kind of funny. I also have Novak and Mav in my top 20 plays. So love that Spencer and I are on him. We were both on Chris Gotterup at the U.S. Open as well, and he obviously got the win last week. So maybe keep an eye out on Novak and Mav in future, smaller events if they don't come through this week. But I like both of those guys in the top 20 market. Adam Scott I actually do like as a pretty solid outright bet, as well as Jason Day and Cameron Young. Scott's at plus 275 for the top 20. Jason Day's plus 300, and then Cameron Young plus 320. Out of all those guys, Jason Day is probably my favorite in this option for guys to bet outright. I do think that he's a guy who's rounding into some strong form. He's competed at some of these stronger fields events over the past month or so. So I'm liking Jason Day quite a bit. So I like him at top 20 at plus 300 as well.
Anything else to add, Spencer, before we call it a show?
I think Novak, McNeely, Scott are probably 3 of those names that I'm most interested in. My model also like Jason Day quite a bit this week. The other play I'll throw out there, and unfortunately it has seen some line movement. If you look at an Aaron Rye over like a Rasmus Højgaard out there, depending on what you can get it at, I think Rye fits a lot of those intangibles that I talked about with Henley. Not quite the same level of approach play that you're going to get from Henley, but a golfer at the end of the day that's going to find a bunch of fairways. And I talked about wide misses being a problem. Rasmus is the king of that, of the wide misses. So I think that is a value play to consider there.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time as always, guys. We can hit the clubhouse now that we have a full card and plenty of action to get us through the 4 days at Royal Portrush there in Northern Ireland. The British Open, the Open Championship, one of the best events in all of sports, an absolute jewel on the calendar for PGA golf and golf enthusiasts all across the world. So looking forward to watching this alongside you guys this week. For Spencer Aguiar and Kyle Murray, I'm Mike Calabrese. Thanks so much for listening to the Best Bets episode for the Open Championship at Royal Portrush. Best of luck on all your bets, and we'll catch you back here next time on the Action Network podcast.